The morning sun made long shadows on the dusty streets of Ouagadougou. President Ibrahim Traoré walked out of his palace. His security guards stayed far behind him. Unlike other world leaders who traveled in big armored cars, Traoré liked to walk alone through his city. This was his way of staying close to the people of Burkina Faso. He wanted to understand their daily struggles and happy moments. The air was filled with the sounds of West African life. Vendors were calling out about their goods. Children were laughing as they played in narrow streets. Motorcycles hummed in the distance as they moved through traffic. Traoré walked with purpose, but not in a hurry. He wore simple, traditional clothes that helped him blend in with the crowd better than any expensive suit could. As he turned a corner near the big market, something caught his eye that made him stop. Under the small shade of an old baobab tree, an elderly man sat on what looked like a bench made from old wooden boxes. The man's clothes were worn thin from being washed many times. They were patched in places where the fabric had torn from time and hardship. But it wasn't the man's poverty that got Traoré's attention. It was something strangely familiar about how he sat, the way he held his head as he carefully read an old, worn book. Traoré's heart started beating fast as he realized who it was. The man's face, though old and weathered by years of struggle, was unmistakable. Those were the same thoughtful eyes that had looked out at countless classrooms. The same gentle hands that had written ideas on blackboards, inspiring many students to think beyond their situations. Professor Adama Traoré whispered, his voice barely heard above the street noise. Memories flooded back like a dam breaking. He remembered sitting in the back row of a crowded classroom, listening as Professor Adama spoke with passion about right and wrong, dignity, and helping others. The professor had been more than a teacher. He had been a light of hope during some of the darkest times in Burkina Faso's history. While politicians made empty promises, Professor Adama had quietly shaped young minds. He taught them that true wealth wasn't in things you could buy, but in knowledge, honesty, and helping others. Traoré remembered how the professor would stay after class to help students who were struggling. He would use his own small salary to buy books for those who couldn't afford them. Professor Adama believed in the power of education like it was a religion, and that belief spread to others. Many of his former students had become doctors, engineers, teachers, and yes, even presidents. Now, seeing his former teacher reading on the streets, sitting on makeshift furniture with nowhere else to go, Traoré felt deep sadness and burning anger. How had the system failed this man so completely? How had society let one of its most valuable people fall through the cracks so badly? Taking a deep breath, Traoré walked slowly closer, not wanting to scare the old man. The professor was deeply focused on his reading, completely unaware of the chaos of the marketplace around him. As Traoré got closer, he could see that the book was a collection of philosophy essays. The same type of material Professor Adama had used to challenge and inspire his students many years ago. Professor Adama, Traoré called softly, his voice thick with emotion. The elderly man looked up, blinking in confusion as his eyes adjusted from the printed page to the face in front of him. For a moment, there was no recognition, just the careful wariness of someone who had learned to be suspicious of unexpected attention. But then, slowly understanding came to Professor Adama's eyes. Ibrahim, the professor whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. Ibrahim Traoré. The old man struggled to stand, his legs shaking with weakness and hunger. Traoré rushed forward, gently taking the professor's arm to help him, feeling how thin and weak his once powerful teacher had become. Mr. President, Professor Adama stammered, clearly embarrassed by his situation. I didn't expect. What are you doing here? Don't call me President, Traoré replied firmly, but with endless kindness. For me, you will always be my teacher. Professor Adama shook his head, tears beginning to form in his eyes as he tried to understand this unexpected meeting. Things have changed so much since those days, Ibrahim. I am no longer the man you knew in that classroom. You will never stop being the man who taught me the value of dignity, Traoré said, his own eyes shining with tears as he held his teacher's weathered hands. But tell me, how did this happen? How did you end up here? The professor hesitated. Clearly uncomfortable talking about his situation, pride that had once filled lecture halls now struggled against the reality of his life. Around them, the marketplace continued its daily rhythm, but for both men, time seemed stopped in this moment of recognition and reunion. This meeting would change everything, not just for Professor Adama, but for thousands of forgotten heroes across Burkina Faso. Professor Adama's shoulders sagged as he prepared to tell the painful truth about his life. The busy marketplace around them seemed to fade into background noise as the weight of years of struggle pressed down on the old teacher. Traoré waited patiently, his heart already breaking for what he knew would be a story of neglect and failure by society. "My house," Professor Adama began, his voice barely above a whisper, "was taken because I couldn't pay my debts. The pension I get after 40 years of service isn't enough to cover even basic living costs." He paused, looking down at his worn hands. "The cost of everything has gone up so much, but our pensions stay the same, as if we too are old things from the past." Traoré listened in silence, feeling familiar anger building inside him. It's not at his teacher, but at a system that had let this terrible thing happen. Professor Adama continued, his voice growing stronger despite the pain clear in every word. Tried to keep teaching privately, offering tutoring to make more money. Some families would pay me a few francs to help their children with math or literature. But my health. He gestured weakly to his thin body. My body began to fail me. The long hours, the stress of not knowing where my next meal would come from, the shame of asking for help. It all hurt me. The professor's eyes grew distant as he told about how his life slowly got worse. "First, I sold my books. Imagine that. Teacher selling his books. Then my furniture, piece by piece. I kept my teaching materials until the very end, hoping I might find steady work again. But who wants to hire a 70-year-old man when there are younger teachers desperate for jobs?" Traoré's jaw tightened as he realized that Professor Adama's story was likely happening all over the country. How many other teachers, healthcare workers, and public servants were suffering in silence, forgotten by the very society they had spent their lives serving? The worst part, Professor Adama continued, wasn't the hunger or the cold nights sleeping. Outside, it was being invisible. People would walk past me on the street. Former students, colleagues, parents of children I had taught, and they wouldn't see me. Or maybe they chose not to see me. I became a ghost, haunting the streets of a city where I had once been respected and valued. The professor's voice cracked as he described the lowest point of his experience. There were nights when I questioned everything I had believed in. Had I wasted my life? Had all those years of teaching, of trying to give values and knowledge to young minds, been for nothing? When society throws you away so completely, you begin to doubt your own worth. Traoré could no longer hold back his emotion. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he listened to his teacher's painful story. This was the man who had taught him about dignity, about the worth of every human being. Now that same man was describing how he had been made to feel worthless by the very system Traoré now led. "Professor Traoré," said, his voice thick with determination, "what you're describing isn't just a personal tragedy, it's a national disgrace. You represent thousands of forgotten heroes who built this country with their hard work and sacrifice." Professor Adama looked up, surprised by the intensity in his former student's voice. "Ibrahim, I appreciate your concern, but individual cases of hardship are hardly the priority of a president. You have a whole nation to think about." "That's exactly the point," Traoré replied firmly. "If we cannot take care of our teachers, our nurses, our farmers, the people who form the backbone of our society, then what kind of nation are we building? What kind of future are we creating for the next generation?" As they spoke, curious people began to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of their president having a deep conversation with an elderly man on the street. Some recognized Professor Adama from their school days, and whispered conversations began to spread through the crowd about the teacher who had inspired so many. Traoré noticed the growing attention but didn't care. This moment was too important to worry about politics or public relations. He helped Professor Adama to his feet, steadying the weak man as he stood. "Come with me," Traoré said with quiet determination. Let's go somewhere we can talk more comfortably. And more importantly, let's begin to fix this injustice right now." Professor Adama hesitated, overwhelmed by this unexpected change in his life. "Ibrahim, I don't want charity. I've kept my dignity even in these hard times. This isn't charity." "Professor, this is justice," Traoré replied. "And it's the very least we can do for someone who gave so much to our country." As they walked toward Traoré's waiting car, the president's mind was already racing with possibilities. This meeting had made clear something that had been troubling him since taking office: the gap between political talk about honoring those who serve and the harsh reality of how society actually treats its most vulnerable contributors. The short walk to the car felt like a journey between two worlds. From the harsh reality of abandonment and neglect to the possibility of redemption and systematic change, Professor Adama, still struggling to understand this dramatic change in his life, allowed himself to be guided by his former student. He didn't yet dare to hope that this meeting might lead to something bigger than personal rescue. The smooth interior of the government car was very different from Professor Adama's recent living conditions. But Traoré barely noticed the luxury. His mind was racing with plans and possibilities as they drove through the streets of Ouagadougou. This wasn't just about helping one man. This was about fixing a system failure that had likely affected thousands of dedicated public servants across Burkina Faso. "Where are we going, Ibrahim?" Professor Adama asked quietly, still struggling. To believe that his life was about to change, "To the Burkina Development Bank," Traoré replied with conviction. "We're going to start a revolution, not with weapons or protests, but with dignity and systematic change." The bank manager, Moussa Ouedraogo, was finishing routine paperwork when his secretary burst into his office with barely contained excitement. "Sir, President Traoré is here. He's walking up to the main entrance right now." Ouedraogo's eyes widened in disbelief. In his 15 years as bank manager, he had never received an unannounced visit from any government official, let alone the president. He quickly straightened his tie and rushed to the main lobby, arriving just as Traoré entered with an elderly man in worn clothing. "Mr. President," Ouedraogo stammered, extending his hand in greeting. "This is an unexpected honor. How may we help you today?" Traoré's response was direct and purposeful. "Mr. Ouedraogo, I want you to meet Professor Adama Ouedraogo, one of the finest teachers our country has ever known. He taught me philosophy and ethics in secondary school, and he has inspired thousands of young Burkinabe over the course of his career." Professor Adama stood quietly beside Traoré, still overwhelmed by the rapid change in his life. Other bank customers and employees began to gather, curious about this unusual scene. "Professor Adama has been living on the streets," Traoré continued, his voice carrying across the bank lobby, "because his pension isn't enough to meet basic living costs. This is unacceptable, and it ends today." Ouedraogo nodded respectfully, though he was clearly uncertain about where this conversation was going. "Of course, Mr. President. What would you like us to do?" Traoré's next words would echo far beyond the walls of the bank. "I want you to set up a special fund for retired teachers and public servants. This fund will make sure that no teacher, nurse, or a civil servant who spent their life serving our country will ever face the hardships that Professor Adama has gone through." The bank manager's eyebrows rose sharply. This wasn't a simple account opening. This was a complete change in how the nation treated its retired public servants. "Mr. President, such an initiative would require a lot of money and coordination. With multiple government departments, then we start today and build it properly." "Traoré," I interrupted firmly. "I want an immediate emergency fund set up that can begin helping people within 48 hours. We'll work out the bigger details later, but people like Professor Adama cannot wait for bureaucratic processes to play out over months or years." As Ouedraogo began taking notes and making calculations, word of the president's surprise visit began spreading through social media. Bank employees quietly took photos and videos, sharing them with hashtags like #DignityForTeachers and #BurkinaFasoCares. Within hours, the story was trending across West Africa. Professor Adama, who had stayed quiet throughout most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "Mr. President, I am deeply grateful for your personal kindness, but I cannot accept help that isn't available to others in similar situations." Traoré smiled, placing a gentle hand on his teacher's shoulder. "Professor, you taught me that true leadership means fixing system-wide problems, not just individual cases. What we're creating here will benefit thousands of people who are currently suffering in silence." The bank manager presented a preliminary plan within an hour. "Mr. President, we can set up an immediate relief fund with government backing. We estimate there are about 3,000 retired teachers and 5,000 other retired public servants who would qualify for enhanced support." "Make it happen," Traoré said without hesitation. "And I want regular reports on how well the program is working. This isn't a publicity stunt. This is a fundamental shift in how we value the people who built our nation." As news of the initiative spread, Professor Adama found himself at the center of a growing movement. Television crews arrived at the bank, and social media buzzed with stories from citizens sharing their own experiences with forgotten teachers and public servants. Retired nurse named Aminata Cohn posted a video describing how she had trained dozens of healthcare workers but was now unable to afford her own medications. A former agricultural extension officer shared his story of teaching farmers modern techniques for decades, only to see his own farm taken for unpaid taxes because his pension wasn't enough. By evening, #Burkina Faso Values was trending internationally, with African leaders and international observers praising Traoré's immediate response to inequality. Professor Adama, now wearing new clothes and having received medical attention, appeared at a brief press conference alongside the president. "Today," Professor Adama said, his voice stronger than it had been in years, "I learned that the values I tried to teach, dignity, compassion, and social responsibility, can indeed be turned into real action. President Traoré has shown that true leadership means seeing the individual human being behind the statistics." The banking revolution had begun. But this was only the start of a much larger transformation that would reshape Burkina Faso's approach to honoring its most dedicated citizens. 6 months after that life-changing meeting on the streets of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso had undergone a transformation that surprised even its most hopeful citizens. The Dignity for Service program, born from President Traoré's meeting with Professor Adama, had grown into one of the most complete social justice initiatives in West Africa. The program's success stories were everywhere. Retired midwife who had delivered over 2,000 babies during her career was now living comfortably in a modest apartment with her medical needs fully covered. Boma Sawadogo, a former agricultural teacher who had revolutionized farming techniques in 3 provinces, was able to repair his home and continue his educational work as a volunteer consultant. But perhaps the most powerful transformation was in Professor Adama himself. No longer the weak, defeated man Traoré had found under the baobab tree, he had become the unofficial ambassador of the program, traveled across Burkina Faso to find other forgotten heroes and make sure they got the support they deserved. On a crisp December morning, Professor Adama stood before 500 gathered teachers, healthcare workers, and civil servants in the National Stadium. The event, called Heroes Recognition Day, had become an annual celebration of public service that was being copied across Africa. "My dear friends and colleagues," Professor Adama began, his voice clear and strong. "6 months ago, I was invisible. Society had written me off as a burden, a forgotten piece of better times. Today I stand before you not as a symbol of failure, but as proof that a society can choose compassion over not caring." The crowd erupted in applause, but Professor Adama raised his hand for silence. "This transformation didn't happen because I was special or because I complained the loudest. It happened because one man, our president, remembered that leadership means seeing the humanity in every citizen." President Traoré, sitting in the front row, felt the same mixture of pride and humility he had experienced that morning at the bank. The program had exceeded even his most ambitious expectations. But more importantly, it had sparked a cultural shift in how Burkinabe thought about service and dignity. The statistics were impressive. Over 8,000 retired public servants now received enhanced support. Child death rates had dropped as experienced. Healthcare workers returned to volunteer roles. Educational outcomes were improving as master teachers like Professor Adama mentored younger educators. But beyond the numbers was something more profound: a renewed sense of national purpose and shared responsibility. International recognition had followed quickly. The African Union had named Burkina Faso's program as a model for continental implementation. Universities across West Africa were studying the initiative as a case study in responsive governance. Professor Adama had been invited to speak at conferences in Dakar, Kara, and Lagos, sharing his story and the lessons learned from Burkina Faso's approach. During his speech at Heroes Recognition Day, Professor Adama reflected on the broader meaning of their success. We have proven that dignity is not a luxury for the wealthy. It is a fundamental right for all citizens. We have shown that a nation's true wealth lies not in its natural resources, but in how it treats those who have given their lives in service to others. The professor paused, looking directly at President Traoré. But perhaps most importantly, we have shown that real leadership requires more than policy papers and cabinet meetings. It requires the courage to walk among your people, to see their struggles firsthand, and to act immediately when you encounter injustice. As the ceremony continued, testimonials poured in from across the country. A retired police officer spoke about being able to afford his diabetes medication for the first time in years. A former postal worker described how the program had allowed her to help her grandchildren with school fees. A retired judge talked about volunteering his expertise to help young lawyers, contributing to society even in retirement. The ripple effects extended far beyond direct beneficiaries. Young people, inspired by the stories of these honored elders, were increasingly choosing careers in public service. Medical schools reported increased applications, and teacher training colleges were experiencing their highest enrollment in decades. The cultural message was clear. Service to others was valued and would be rewarded. Professor Adama concluded his speech with words that would be quoted in newspapers across Africa. Today we celebrate not just the individuals who have been helped, but the soul of a nation that chose to honor its values. We celebrate a president who proved that true power lies in lifting others up, not in accumulating personal wealth or glory. As the crowd dispersed, President Traoré approached his former teacher. Professor, do you remember what you taught us about the difference between success and significance? Professor Adama smiled, remembering countless classroom discussions about philosophy and ethics. Success is what you achieve for yourself. Significance is what you achieve for others. Today, Traoré said, embracing his mentor, I finally understand the full meaning of that lesson. Thank you for teaching me then, and now, what it means to lead with purpose. The two men stood together as the sun set over Ouagadougou, representing a story that had captured imaginations far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. They had proven that individual acts of compassion, when backed by systematic action and genuine political will, could indeed transform entire societies. Their story became a testament to the power of remembering that behind every policy decision are real human beings with hopes, dreams, and fundamental dignity that must never be forgotten.